Dear friends, hello and glad to see you again. We continue our talks on Russian writers and their short stories, and this time let us talk about a short story of one of the most famous, at the same time most contradictory Russian writers, I mean Lev Tolstoy, and a short story that is called Father Sergius. As you may have noticed, I am a big fan of this writer, and I like most of his works. I tried to be at every place where he lived, at every museum of Lev Tolstoy, and I have a few things to say about him. But today we have to mention that he lived a relatively long life. There are few Russian authors that lived as long as he did. Have a look at the dates of his birth and death. And he participated in Crimean War. He lived throughout the 19th century. And in general, we can say that in his books, the history of that century is reflected. Now, I am especially fond of the monuments that you can see now on the screen. And this monument is located in Moscow, and it was made just after the death of Lev Tolstoy in 1913. Don't you find that in this particular monument, Leo Tolstoy he has some Socratic features about him. Obviously, the sculptor compares the figure of this writer to Socrates, probably showing that the works by Leo Tolstoy also have this special simple wisdom that Socrates had. And the next picture is actually the house that belonged to Leo Tolstoy. This was down south from Moscow, about 200 miles down south in the place called Yasnaya Polyana. This is a beautiful estate that belonged to Leo Tolstoy, and you can see it is frequented by tourists. So this is basically the atmosphere I wanted to give you before we disembark on talking about this writer and his work that is called Father Sergius. Interesting that this work was created by Leo Tolstoy within a relatively long period. Have a look at the dates. He was working on this short story for more than 8 years. And if we compare it with some of his novels, it took longer for Leo Tolstoy to create this short story than some of his novels. But why? One more question for you. Why didn't he publish it while he was still alive? Have a look at the screen. It was published posthumously, only after his death in 1911. Was he afraid? If so, what specifically was he afraid of? Let's read the story and try to answer these questions. One more interesting thing is that in this short story, you can have the walk of life of Leo Tolstoy, especially in his late years. So this is a very deep insight in the philosophy of Leo Tolstoy by the end of his days. Let's have a look at the screen. In Petersburg, in the 1840s, a surprising event occurred. An officer of the Cuirassier Life Guards, a handsome prince who everyone predicted would become aide-de-camp to the Emperor Nicholas I and have a brilliant career, left the service, broke off his engagement to a beautiful maid of honor, a favorite of the Empress's, gave his small estate to his sister, and retired to a monastery to become a monk. This event appeared extraordinary and inexplicable to those who didn't know his inner motives. But for Prince Stepan Kasatsky himself, it all occurred so naturally that he could not imagine how he could have acted otherwise. So again, this is very uncommon for a person who is pursuing a military career and who is trying to find a good position at the court to suddenly break all the ties and go to the monastery. We are now introduced to the main character of this short story. His name is Stepan Kasatsky. He is noble, he is relatively rich, and he has a beautiful career ahead of him. But suddenly he breaks it all. What made him to do so? Let's see a bit of a retrospective and let's have a look at what was the background of this act. So, the Emperor Nicholas Pavlovich, Nicholas I, had noticed him while he was still at the college and continued to take notice of him in the regiments. And it was on this account that people predicted for him an appointment as aide-de-camp to the Emperor. Kasatsky himself strongly desired it, not from ambition only, but chiefly because since his cadet days he had been passionately devoted to Nicholas Pavlovich. The Emperor had often visited the military college, and every time Kasatsky saw that tall, erect figure with breast expanded in its military overcoat entering with brisk step, saw the cropped side whiskers, the moustache, the aquiline nose, and heard the sonorous voice exchanging greetings with the cadets, he was seized by the same rapture that he experienced later on when he met the woman he loved. Dear friends, in simple words, the main character was in love with his emperor since his childhood. He adored the image of his emperor. And have a look, please, at the next slide. The emperor that is mentioned here is a historical figure, Nicholas I. He reigned Russia from 1825 until 1855. As you can see, well, he seems to be a very nice personality. So probably in the eyes of a young boy, he can become a lovable person. And that is the inner feeling of Stepan Kasatsky that brings him closer and closer to the emperor. One more interesting thing that Stepan Kasatsky lost his father when he was a child. And in many ways, the figure of the emperor for him is sort of fatherly figure. He is subconsciously looking for a father in the Emperor Nicholas I. This is very important for us because this will bring the change into the plots. And further on, he meets a beautiful girl, maid of honor of the Empress, and they seem to be in love with each other. And there is a moment when they have to express each other's feelings. And let's have a careful look at this scene. Everything starts very romantically. Please have a look at the text. He was particularly in love that day, but did not experience any sensual desire for her. On the contrary, he regarded her with tender adoration as something unattainable. He rose to his full height, standing before her, with both hands on his saber. I have only now realized what happiness a man can experience, and it is you, my darling, who have given me this happiness, he said, with a timid smile. Diamonds had not yet become usual between them, and feeling himself morally inferior, he felt terrified at this stage to use them to such an angel. It is thanks to you that I have come to know myself. I have learned that I am better than I thought. I have known that for a long time. That was why I began to love you. Nightingales trilled nearby, and the fresh leafage rustled, moved by a passing breeze. Did you notice how idyllical is this scene? Nothing can break the happiness of these two people, except one small things, except one small thing that makes all the change. Can you guess what? It is a very unexpected twist of the plot. Have a look. "Listen," says his bride, "I cannot deceive you. I have to tell you. You ask what it is? It is that I have loved before." She again laid her hand on his with an imploring gesture. He was silent. "You want to know who it was?" "It was the emperor." Have a look at the answer of Stepan Kasatsky. He doesn't get the idea. He doesn't understand the point. "We all love him. I can imagine you, a schoolgirl at the institute." "No, it was later. I was infatuated, but it passed. I must tell you." "Well, what of it?" "No, it was not simply—" She covered her face with her hands. "What? You gave yourself to him?" She was silent. "His mistress?" She did not answer. "Do you see now what is the important change that makes the twist to the plot?" Nothing could be more hard for Stepan Kasatsky at that particular moment. At the same time, he lost his father because he was seeing Nicholas I as a fatherly figure, and his bride because, in fact, he discovers that his bride was a mistress of the Tsar. What can he possibly do in the situation except becoming a monk? He sprang up and stood before her with trembling jaws, pale as death. He now remembered how the emperor, meeting him on the Nevsky, had amiably congratulated him. "Oh God, what have I done, Stiva? Don't touch me, don't touch me. Oh, how it pains." He turned away and went to the house. There he met her mother. "What is the matter, Prince?" She became silent on seeing his face. The blood had suddenly rushed to his head. "You knew it, and used me to shield them. If you weren't a woman," he cried, lifting his enormous fist, and turning aside, he ran away. Had his fiancée's lover been a private person, he would have killed him, but it was his beloved Tsar. Next day he applied both for furlough and his discharge, and professing to be ill so as to see no one, he went away to the country. He spent the summer at his village arranging his affairs. When summer was over, he did not return to Petersburg, but entered a monastery and there became a monk. That is his decision, to separate from the world that was so cruel to him, to separate from the world that he hated and to become a better person, to serve God. But when you separate yourself from the society, is it a straight way to find a way to God? Does it always help? This is a question that Leo Tolstoy states in this particular short story. So let's see how it goes. The abbot of that monastery was a gentleman by birth, a learned writer and a starets. Please mind this word. That is, he belonged to that succession of monks originating in Wallachia, who each choose a director and teacher whom they implicitly obey. This superior had been a disciple of the starets Ambrose, who was a disciple of Macarius, who was a disciple of the starets Leonid, who was a disciple of Paisy Velichkovsky. So this abbot Kasatsky submitted himself as to his chosen director. Here, in the monastery, besides the feeling of ascendancy over others that such a life gave him, he felt much as he had done in the world. He found satisfaction in attaining the greatest possible perfection outwardly as well as inwardly. This is a very tricky moment, dear friends. Have a careful look. He is going to the monastery and he is becoming a monk with an aim of approaching God. But as all the starets would teach, the easiest way to approach God is by humility, is by humbleness. But here, as it is clear from the text, everything Stepan Kasatsky does, he does from pride. He wants to be the best everywhere. If not at the court, so at the monastery. He wants to be the purest. He wants to ascend above others. Is he going to find God? Or there is a certain tragedy that is awaiting for him? Let's keep going. Next day, Father Sergius asked pardon of the abbot and of the brethren for his pride, but at the same time, after a night spent in prayer, he decided that he must leave this monastery, and he wrote to the starets begging permission to return to him. He wrote that he felt his weakness and incapacity to struggle against temptation without his help, and penitently confessed his sin of pride. By return of post came a letter from the starets, who wrote that Sergius's pride was the cause of all that had happened. The old man pointed out that his fits of anger were due to the fact that in refusing all clerical honors he humiliated himself, not for the sake of God, but for the sake of his pride. Have a look at the very careful and a very subtle advice of his spiritual leader. He says, you are humiliating yourself, and that's okay, this is the right way, but you have to be very careful with your inner feeling. What are you doing it for? Because serving God in the eyes of Leo Tolstoy, is very much like serving other people, but not trying to separate from them. And we can see that the main mistake of Stepan Kasatsky is trying to be different, trying to be better than others. So the only thing that can lead him to the right way, that can help him to approach God, is a sort of spiritual transformation. In the short story, there is a very important scene when, during spring holidays, a group of people come to the monastery, and one lady stays in the monastery overnight, and with a special permission of the Father Superior of the monastery, she stays in the cell of Father Sergius. Mind that Stepan Kasatsky, after becoming a monk, changes his name. And now he is not Stepan, now he is Father Sergius. And she asks a permission to stay in his cell, and for some reason, just as a matter of fun, she wants to seduce him. And at night, she is making all kinds of efforts to play with him, to call him. And Father Sergius feels a strong desire to her. So guess what he does? Have a careful look at the slide. For God's sake, come to me, I am dying. Oh, well, shall I perish? No, not so. I will come to you directly, he said. And having opened his door, he went without looking at her through the cell into the porch where he used to chop wood. There he felt for the block and for an axe, which leaned against the wall. Immediately, he said, and taking up the axe with his right hand, he laid the forefinger of his left hand on the block, swung the axe, and struck with it below the second joint. The finger flew off more lightly than a stick of similar thickness, and bounding up, turned over on the edge of the block and then fell to the floor. He heard it fall before he felt any pain, but before he had time to be surprised, he felt a burning pain and the warmth of flowing blood. So the only way to fight the seduction he finds is by hurting himself, by cutting off his finger. When the woman that stays in his cell sees that and understands that, she's shocked. And she understands that she was the cause of it. she feels very guilty, and she asks what she can do to be forgiven. "Forgive me," she said. "How can I atone for my sin?" "Go away. Let me tie up your hand. Go away from here." She took a seat in the sledge and did not utter a word all the way home. A year later, she entered a convent as a novice and lived a strict life under the direction of the hermit Arseny. Have a look at the spiritual transformation of a lady who wanted to seduce Father Sergius, but now she becomes a nun herself. Of course, that gives a certain spiritual support to Father Sergius, and many people consider him as a saint. So now he has a chance to help others. But did he defeat his pride? Did he really do so? We can find an answer in the next scene. Mind that the girl who tried to seduce him was a very rich, a very noble and good-looking woman. But the next scene is when a merchant brings in his sick daughter, who is not that rich, who is not that beautiful, and who is not that noble. And guess what happens? The pride that was inside Father Sergius was like a weak point where the spirit of Father Sergius breaks. So have a look at the next scene. The merchant came, leading his daughter by the arm. He led her into the cell and immediately left her. She was a very fair girl, plump and very short, with a pale, frightened, childish face and a much developed feminine figure. As she passed by him, he was acutely conscious of her femininity, though he saw by her face that she was sensual and feeble-minded. He rose and went into the cell. She was sitting on a stool waiting for him, and when he entered, she rose. "What are you suffering from?" "I am in pain all over," she said, and suddenly her face lit up with a smile. "You will be well," said he. "Pray." "What is the use of praying? I have prayed and it does no good," and she continued to smile. "I want you to pray for me and lay your hands on me. I saw you in a dream." "How did you see me?" "I saw you put your hands on my breast like that." She took his hand and pressed it to her breast, just here. He yielded his right hand to her. "What is your name?" he asked, trembling all over and feeling that he was overcome and that his desire had already passed beyond control. "Marie." "Why?" She took his hand and kissed it, and then put her arm round his waist and pressed him to herself. "What are you doing?" he said. "Marie, you are a devil." "Oh, perhaps. What does it matter?" And embracing him, she sat down with him on the bed. At dawn, he went out into the porch. This is a very strong scene. It is very difficult to explain why in the first case he was able to fight the seduction, and in the second case he was not. But ultimately he gives in, and he is seduced, and he considers himself a sinner. And the strongest part of it is that he starts to realize that all the way that he did, all the things that he did, all the way that he passed was ultimately useless. He was trying to perfect himself, but in vain, and he was seduced by a feeble-minded daughter of a merchant. So was it worth becoming a monk and an hermit to be seduced by a daughter of a merchant? He understands that he is on a completely wrong track, and the way to God is different. So what it is? Guess what he does next? And Sergius remembered having seen her sins then. He suddenly remembers that he's got a sister who lives a very humble life, who has a husband who is having drinking problems, but she is living for the sake of other people. So maybe Just maybe he thinks I should go and learn from her how to serve other people. Maybe this is going to bring me closer to God. Long after, just before he became a monk, she had married a landowner who squandered all her fortune and was in the habit of beating her. She had had 2 children, a son and a daughter, but the son had died while still young. And Sergius remembered having seen her very wretched. Then again, he had seen her in the monastery when she was a widow. She had been still the same, not exactly stupid, but insipid, insignificant, and pitiable. She had come with her daughter and her daughter's fiancé. They were already poor at that time, and later on he had heard that she was living in a small provincial town and was very poor. So this is so unusual that instead of going to learn from a monk or from a starets, he comes to learn from a very simple and kind of unhappy woman. He meets her and they recognize each other. He calls her Pashenka, and have a look at their dialogue. Pashenka, I have come to you, take me in. His beautiful black eyes, shining with the tears that started in them, were fixed on her with imploring insistence. And under his grayish mustache, his lips quivered piteously. Praskovia Mikhailovna pressed her hands to her withered breast, opened her mouth, and stood petrified, staring at the pilgrim with dilated eyes. It can't be! Stepan! Sergei! Father Sergius! Yes, it is I, said Sergius in a low voice, only not Sergius or Father Sergius, but a great sinner. Stepan Kasatsky, a great and lost sinner. Take me in and help me. It's impossible. How have you so humbled yourself? But come in. She reached out her hand, but he did not take it and only followed her in. After a long talk that he has with her, he understands that he was on a completely wrong track. He was trying to perfect himself without causing any use to others. And he started to understand that the only way to approach God is to be humble for Christ's sake, but not for the sake of your own pride. And there is an important scene where Stepan Kasatsky leaves his sister Pashenka and he goes on pilgrimage on foot. And out of a sudden, he meets a Frenchman who gives him some money for charity. He is a nobleman, he is a monk, and the French people, after a war with Napoleon, were not that welcome in Russia. But look what he does. The Frenchman found some small change and gave 20 kopecks to each of the pilgrims, and he patted Kasatsky on the shoulder with his gloved hand. May Christ bless you, replied Kasatsky, without replacing his cap and bowing his bald head. He rejoiced particularly at this meeting, because he had disregarded the opinion of men and had done the simplest, easiest thing, humbly accepted 20 kopecks and given them to his comrade, a blind beggar. The less importance he attached to the opinion of men, the more did he feel the presence of God within him. This is a very important message. Basically, this is the compression of all the meanings that Leo Tolstoy tried to develop throughout his life. Giving less importance to the opinion of other people, but helping them in a humble way. That's what makes a person a true Christian. And let's look at the end of the story. For 8 months, Kasatsky tramped on in this manner, and in the 9th month, he was arrested for not having a passport. Try to look at this situation now. A Russian nobleman, a person who was very close to the emperor, is arrested for not having a passport. What happens next? This happened at a night refuge in a provincial town, where he had passed the night with some pilgrims. He was taken to the police station, and when asked who he was and where was his passport, he replied that he had no passport and that he was a servant of God. He was classed as a tramp, sentenced, and sent to live in Siberia. In Siberia, he has settled down as the hired man of a well-to-do peasant in which capacity he works in the kitchen garden, teaches children, and attends to the sick. This is the way to serve God that he has found. And in simple words, we can say that the idea of Leo Tolstoy is that the best way to serve God is to serve other people, not to separate yourself from them in a monastery, in a cloister, in a nunnery, but to come and help. And this is the only way to approach God in the eyes of Leo Tolstoy. Thank you very much for your attention, and see you next time.